The first sound he heard wasn't a voice. It was the steady, mechanical beep, beep, beep that pierced through the fog inside his head. Malcolm Price opened his eyes to a blur of light and white walls. Everything felt distant, the ceiling above him, the weight of his own body, even the pain. It was like waking up at the bottom of a river, slow and heavy, with no sense of time. His mouth was dry, his throat burning, his chest tight beneath the bandages. He blinked a few times, trying to understand where he was. The sterile smell, the sound of machines, the tubes running into his arm. A hospital. His mind was blank. Then a faint image cut through the haze. A cold night, laughter echoing off concrete, boots kicking ribs, a hand ripping away his backpack. After that, nothing. Just blackness. Now he was here, alive, barely. He turned his head slightly and noticed another bed a few feet away. A young woman lay there, motionless, her face pale beneath an oxygen mask. Her heartbeat flickered across the monitor beside her, a green line that rose and fell like the tide. He couldn't explain why he kept watching it. Maybe because it was the only thing that reminded him he wasn't completely alone in that silent room. Then the sound changed. The beeping, once steady, began to slow. A gap, then another. The green line twitched, then dropped flat for a fraction of a second before rising again, unsteady and weak. Malcolm frowned. Maybe the machine was wrong. Maybe someone would come. He pressed the call button beside his bed. Nothing. A few seconds passed. The sound dipped again. This time, the line almost went flat. Something inside him snapped, not panic, but instinct. He tore the IV needle from his arm, ignoring the sting. Blood ran down his wrist as he swung his legs off the bed. His body screamed in pain, his knees nearly giving out, but he caught himself on the railing. The woman's monitor let out a long, piercing tone. Beep! A sound no one could mistake. No, he muttered, stumbling forward. The floor was cold under his bare feet, the world spinning. He reached her bed and saw her chest still. No rise, no fall. Just silence. He looked around. The hallway beyond the curtain was empty. No nurse, no doctor. He placed his hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cold. Hey, breathe, he whispered. Come on, stay with me. He didn't know what else to do. He had no training, no plan, just desperation. He pressed down on her chest, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe. Her body jerked under his palms. Nothing. Come on, he gasped. His own stitches tore as he leaned in, giving 2 shallow breaths, air trembling from his lungs. Then again. 1, 2, 3. The sound returned, faint at first, then stronger. The line on the monitor flickered back to life. Beep, beep, beep. He froze, staring at the screen. His vision blurred, and for a second he thought he was dreaming it. The rhythm, the life, returning. The curtain burst open. 2 nurses and a doctor rushed in, shouting orders. Step back, sir, let us. Malcolm stumbled backward, gripping the metal frame for balance. His legs gave way, and he collapsed into the corner. They surrounded her, adjusting tubes, calling her name. The doctor looked up at him once, eyes wide with disbelief. What the hell did you do? Malcolm didn't answer. His heart was hammering, his breath uneven. He looked down at his trembling hands, still stained with blood and sweat. She wasn't breathing, he murmured. The doctor didn't reply. He just stared at him for a moment longer before turning back to the woman. Minutes passed. The chaos faded. The room filled again with the rhythmic sound, steady, alive. One of the nurses touched his shoulder gently. You saved her, she said quietly. Malcolm didn't respond. He looked at the monitor, the little green line still moving, defying death, and then back at his own shaking hands. For the first time in years he realized they'd done something that mattered, something that still had weight. He leaned his head against the wall, eyes half closed, whispering to no one in particular, I just didn't want her to die. Then everything went black again. When Malcolm opened his eyes again, it was morning. The light was soft, filtered through half-closed blinds. The smell of disinfectant clung to the air. Somewhere down the hallway someone was laughing. A nurse, maybe, or a visitor. He turned his head slowly. The bed beside him was empty. The woman was gone. For a long moment he just stared at the space where she'd been, the sheets neatly folded, the heart monitor silent. The only trace she'd ever been there was a faint impression on the pillow. He thought she might have died. The idea struck him like a punch. But then he heard two nurses whispering just outside the door. "Yeah, she's stable now. It's a miracle she made it through the night." "Did you hear what happened?" "Some homeless guy saved her, the one they found in the alley last week." "Seriously?" "I saw him when they brought him in. I thought he wouldn't last the night either." Malcolm closed his eyes. So she was alive. The words "some homeless guy" echoed in his head. He'd heard that phrase his whole life, but never had it felt heavier. That's what he was now. Not a man, not a name, just a shape people avoided on sidewalks. He tried to remember the alley, the last night before the hospital. The rain had been falling hard, soaking through his torn jacket. He'd found an empty spot behind a grocery store dumpster, huddled under cardboard trying to stay dry. Then came the voices. 3 of them, young, drunk, laughing. They started calling him names, asking if he wanted company. He told them to leave him alone. One of them kicked over his bag. Inside that bag was everything he had left: a pair of socks, an old watch, and a photo of a boy with a bright smile and missing front tooth. His son from a different lifetime. When they tried to take the bag, he fought back. One of them hit him with something, metal, hard, and everything went dark. Now here he was, alive, somehow. He shifted, wincing at the pain that flared across his ribs. The doctor entered, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Price," he said. "You had us worried? You've been unconscious for days?" Malcolm blinked. "How long?" "6, the doctor said, checking his chart. "We weren't sure you'd wake up. You lost a lot of blood, several broken ribs, concussion." He paused. "But you pulled through, and apparently you saved a life while you were at it." Malcolm frowned. She's okay? "She's stable. You should be proud of yourself." He didn't feel proud. He felt hollow. Pride was something for people with futures. He didn't even have shoes. The doctor hesitated, then added, "Your medical expenses have been covered, all of them." Malcolm looked up sharply. "By who?" The doctor smiled faintly. "Mr. Whitmore, the young woman's father. He said you're to stay as long as you need." The name meant nothing to Malcolm, but the way the doctor said it, with quiet awe, told him everything. Someone powerful. Someone from a world that didn't see people like him. He lay there for hours after the doctor left, staring at the ceiling. He'd slept under bridges, in shelters, on church steps, and not one of those nights had felt as strange as this one. The bed was soft, the room warm, and yet he couldn't rest. He should have been thankful. Instead, he felt like an imposter. Later that evening, a nurse brought him food, real food, hot and heavy with steam. He tried to eat, but every bite tasted wrong, like it wasn't meant for him. He thought about the woman, Grace, the doctor had called her, and wondered if she'd remember him when she woke up again. Probably not. People like her didn't look back. As he lay in the dim light, his thoughts wandered to the photograph that was gone now, lost in the alley. His boy, Nathan, would be 15 by now. He hadn't seen him since the day he was taken away. The memory clawed at him. The social worker's cold tone, the small hand slipping out of his. "Daddy's going to fix it, okay?" he'd said. But he hadn't. He never fixed anything. Malcolm turned on his side, pressing his forehead to the pillow. The hospital room was quiet, except for the hum of machines. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, steady, alive, and yet every part of him felt like it didn't belong here. He whispered to the darkness, "Why me?" And in the silence that followed, there was no answer, only that same soft beep, beep, beep echoing faintly from somewhere down the hall, like a reminder that life, for reasons beyond his understanding, still hadn't given up on him. The door opened before Malcolm had a chance to think. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He didn't smile. He didn't move with warmth. He simply looked at Malcolm, studying him as one might study a foreign object. "Mr. Price," the man said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm Edward Whitmore. My daughter—" He paused, eyes flicking to the empty bed beside Malcolm. "Was the one you saved last night." Malcolm's throat went dry. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to lie, to disappear back into the hospital bed, to pretend none of it had happened. Instead, He just nodded. Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, laying it carefully on the bedside table. "Your medical bills are covered, all of them. If you need anything, this is how you contact me." Malcolm stared at the card. It felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy ocean, too bright to be real. He didn't move, didn't speak. Edward's eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of something human passing through the cold surface. "I know people like you usually get lost in the cracks," he said quietly. "But last night, you weren't lost. You made a choice that mattered." Malcolm shook his head slightly. I just didn't want her to die." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned and left, leaving the door open just long enough for Malcolm to see the hallway stretching beyond, bright, immaculate, and completely foreign. Alone again, Malcolm stared at the card. Edward Whitmore. A name from a world he had never belonged to, a world of expensive suits, perfectly pressed shirts, and people who had never had to sleep under the cold, wet streets. He thought about the alley, the rain, the kicks, the laughter, the blood. About the bag that had contained his only keepsakes, a worn photo of his son, a cracked watch, a pair of tattered socks. Everything he had lost, everything he had been forced to leave behind. He felt a bitter twist in his stomach, gratitude mixed with disbelief. Why would someone like Edward Whitmore care about someone like him? He'd spent years being invisible, ignored, treated like nothing. And now, someone had seen him, even if just for a moment. Later, the nurse came by with his breakfast. The tray clattered lightly on the table, and the steam rose in thin, curling waves. Malcolm poked at the food. His appetite wasn't there. He hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. "Mr. Price," the nurse said, softer now, "you saved her life. And it seems, well, I think you've saved something for yourself, too. Maybe not yet, but soon." He stared at her blankly. Saved something for himself? What could that possibly mean? He didn't feel saved. He felt hollow. Hours passed. The room remained quiet except for the distant hum of the hospital. The machines continued their steady beep, reminding him that, for reasons he could not explain, he was still here, alive. He whispered to the empty room, voice shaking, "Why me?" There was no answer, only the faint beep, beep, beep of a heartbeat, hers alive, and the slow, stubborn rhythm of his own, echoing inside his chest like a promise he wasn't sure he deserved. When Malcolm woke that afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the blinds was harsh and almost painful. His head throbbed with the dull ache of bruises and medication. Every movement reminded him of the beating he had taken in the alley, and yet, strangely, he felt alert. He turned his head toward the empty bed beside him. The monitor was quiet now, its green line steady. He had saved her, and she was alive. That alone should have been enough, but a part of him felt hollow, as if nothing could fill the emptiness he carried inside. Then the door opened, and the sound of soft, careful footsteps made him tense. "Mr. Price?" The voice was light, melodic, and hesitant. Malcolm turned to see a young woman standing there, her hair slightly tousled, eyes wide and cautious. She looked fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her gaze that made him instinctively step back, unsure if he belonged in the same room as her. I'm Grace," she said slowly. "Grace Whitmore. You saved my life." Malcolm's throat tightened. Words felt heavy, foreign. It was nothing," he muttered. Grace shook her head, a faint smile breaking through the pallor of her face. "It wasn't nothing. You kept me alive. I don't know how to thank you." He swallowed hard. He wasn't used to gratitude, certainly not from someone like her, someone from a world so far removed from his own. You would have done the same," he said quietly, though he didn't fully believe it. She studied him, noticing the trembling of his hands, the scars and bruises that traced his arms and face. Her gaze softened, and she tilted her head slightly. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Malcolm's eyes flicked away, down at the floor. Every memory he had tried to bury pressed against him now, the lost apartment, the endless nights on concrete, the hunger, the isolation, the absence of his son. "Yeah," he muttered, "a lot." Grace took a careful step closer, her voice gentle. "I don't care what anyone else says, you're not just some homeless guy. You're a person who mattered enough to save a life." Malcolm looked at her, unsure how to respond. The words felt alien, almost like they didn't belong in his world. No one had ever seen him like that, as someone who mattered. She hesitated, then added, "I want to know you, not as my savior, not as some story. Just you, Malcolm." His name sounded strange coming from her lips, soft and sincere. He swallowed, fighting the lump rising in his throat. I don't know if there's anything to know," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "There's always something to know. Everyone has a story, Malcolm. I want to hear yours." He looked at the pale curve of her wrist where the IV had been removed, the quiet lines of her face, the faint marks of fear still lingering. Somehow, even in the hospital room, even in his worn jacket and battered body, he felt human again. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to meet her eyes fully. And in them, he didn't see judgment. He saw curiosity, a spark of trust. "You saved my life," she said again, softer this time. "I owe you that much. But maybe I can also help you start living again." Malcolm's chest tightened. He wanted to shake his head, to tell her that no one could help someone like him, that he didn't deserve it. But the sincerity in her eyes made him pause. For a moment, the hospital room disappeared, and all he could see was a life that might still be possible. A life where he wasn't invisible, where his actions mattered, where maybe he could begin again. He swallowed hard, and for the first time in years, a faint glimmer of hope stirred inside him. Malcolm didn't sleep well that night. The hospital bed was soft, too soft, and every muscle screamed in protest from the beating he had taken. His mind, however, was wide awake. Images of Grace's pale face, the moment her chest rose under his hands, her voice trembling with life. They haunted him. When the door opened the next morning, he tensed instinctively. He was ready for anyone, doctor, nurse, or even the security guard who had stared at him suspiciously yesterday. But it wasn't any of them. It was Edward Whitmore. The man's presence filled the room immediately. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and his gaze was precise, appraising. He didn't smile, but Malcolm could feel the weight of his attention like a physical force. "Mr. Price," Edward said, "I hope I'm not intruding." Malcolm stayed silent, unsure if words were even necessary. Edward continued, "My daughter has spoken highly of you. She insists that you be properly compensated and supported, not just for saving her life, but for who you are. That's unusual, I know." He pulled a leather folder from under his arm and set it on the bedside table. "This contains arrangements for housing, medical rehabilitation, and a small stipend while you regain your footing. It's immediate, no questions, no bureaucracy." Malcolm's hands trembled. He stared at the folder as if it were a weapon. He had been through plenty of false promises. People who claimed they wanted to help, only to disappear the moment it became inconvenient. He had learned the hard way. Nothing was ever free. I can't accept this," he said finally, voice hoarse. I don't need handouts." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. Instead, he said quietly, almost as if he were explaining a complicated equation, "This isn't a handout, Malcolm. You saved my daughter's life. This is a start, not charity, a chance. You earned it." Malcolm looked down at the floor. Every instinct told him to refuse. Pride, shame, mistrust, all screamed at him. Accepting help meant acknowledging that he couldn't survive on his own, that the years on the streets hadn't made him invincible. Grace appeared at the door, quiet but firm. "Dad," she said, "he saved my life. Maybe we can save his." Edward's eyes softened, and he nodded once, sharply. "This offer stands. Take it or leave it. But consider this carefully. You're alive today because of your choices. Don't waste the next ones." Malcolm stared at the folder again. The paper felt heavy with possibility. He thought of the alleys, the bridges, the nights spent in cold rain, and the photograph of his son he had lost long ago. Could he even imagine a future now? Could he let someone else build it for him? He swallowed. The lump in his throat burned. For years he had lived believing that the world owed him nothing. And now, Someone was offering him everything he didn't dare hope for. I'll think about it, he finally muttered. Grace stepped closer. Think fast, she said softly, because you don't get second chances like this every day. Malcolm looked from her to Edward, back to the folder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something unfamiliar, a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the moment where survival became more than just holding on. Maybe this was the beginning. Malcolm's first week in the rehab program was quiet chaos. The apartment assigned to him was small but clean, the walls unblemished by years of graffiti or dirt. Furniture smelled faintly of polish and new fabric. For the first time in what felt like decades, he didn't have to worry about where he'd sleep tonight, or if the rain would soak him through, or if someone would kick over his few belongings for fun. And yet, the quiet was deafening. He spent hours staring into the mirror in the bathroom, examining the reflection that seemed both familiar and alien. The skin around his eyes was rough, scarred from the past weeks of abuse. His hands, calloused and cracked, had once been instruments of survival, opening locks, holding cardboard, fending off strangers. Now they were idle, trembling slightly as he washed his face. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he muttered, almost to himself. Grace had stopped by that afternoon. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, probably stolen from some meticulously curated garden outside the hospital. She placed them on the counter and leaned against the doorway, watching him silently for a moment. "You don't have to face this alone," she said gently. Malcolm didn't respond. He turned away, splashing cold water on his face, trying to wash off the years of grime that somehow seemed to cling to his soul, not just his skin. Over the next few days, he began attending sessions with a counselor provided by Edward's Foundation. At first, he resisted every word, every question. Trust didn't come easily, and people like him, people who had been invisible for so long, rarely survived when they let someone in. But each session was a mirror in its own way. Each word forced him to confront memories he had tried to bury, the alleyways, the fights, the nights he went without food, and the face of his son, whose memory was both warmth and dagger. The counselor, a patient woman named Rosa, didn't push him. She simply asked him to tell his story, not for judgment, not for advice, but just to acknowledge it, to give it weight. And so he began. At first it was fractured, scattered sentences, spilling out like jagged shards. I had a kid. I lost him. I lost everything. I ended up here. I got hit. I woke up. I saved someone. That's all I know. Rosa listened. No interruptions. No pity. Only listening. And in that simple act, Malcolm began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. A sense that his life mattered, even in its broken, jagged fragments. One morning, standing in front of the mirror again, he noticed subtle changes. His eyes seemed clearer. His posture, though still wary, had a trace of steadiness. For the first time, he didn't look away when he saw himself. He remembered Edward's words. "You're alive today because of your choices. Don't waste the next ones." Malcolm realized that survival was not enough anymore. He needed to reclaim himself, not the man he once was, not the boy who had lost everything, but someone capable of existing in a world that had never been kind to him. Grace visited often, bringing warmth in small gestures, coffee, sandwiches, quiet conversation. She didn't hover. She didn't judge. She reminded him of something long forgotten, connection. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Each reflection in the mirror became less about shame and more about possibility. Malcolm Price, the man who had once been invisible to the world, was beginning to see himself for the first time. And in that quiet, fragile awakening, he understood something crucial. Survival had brought him here, but living, truly living, would require a courage he had never known. It was a rainy Tuesday when Malcolm's fragile routine began to crack. The city outside his small apartment rattled with the sound of tires on wet pavement, and the smell of damp asphalt seeped through the open window. He should have been grateful. He had a warm bed, food, a chance to start over. Yet an old, familiar panic rose in his chest. A knock came at the door. Malcolm froze. His hands tightened into fists. He hadn't seen anyone from the street since leaving the alley, but fear had a way of sneaking in unannounced. "Mr. Price?" a voice called politely. "Delivery for you." He hesitated, then opened the door. A man in a simple brown uniform held a package. No return address, no name, just a box. Malcolm took it slowly, feeling the weight in his hands. Something about it felt wrong. His pulse accelerated, memories of muggings, fights, and threats flashing through his mind. He closed the door and set the box on the table. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a photograph. His photograph. From years ago. The same one of his son Nathan, cracked and faded. Only now, scrawled across the back in jagged handwriting, were words that made his stomach drop. "You can't run from what you left behind." Malcolm's hands shook as he reread the message. Every instinct screamed danger. Every memory he had buried began clawing its way back. The alleys, the gangs, the people who had wanted him gone. Maybe someone had finally found him. He sank into the chair, gripping the photo as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered. Fear mixed with anger, rage, shame. The world he had tried to escape was clawing back in. Grace arrived later, unaware of the package. She smiled softly, holding a small thermos of tea. "Malcolm, I thought you might like this." He wanted to hide it, the photograph, the message, but the weight of it pressed into his hands like lead. Finally, he let her see it. Her eyes widened. "Malcolm, you have to call someone. You can't face this alone." He shook his head violently. "No, I don't go back. I can't. All of this, it's my life now. I'm not going back to that." Grace stepped closer, her voice firm but gentle. "You're not going back, but you can't let fear control you. We can figure this out together." Malcolm looked at her, at the unwavering concern in her eyes. Something inside him faltered. Trust, that fragile, precarious trust, began to take root again. He realized that running had always been his default, running from pain, running from responsibility, running from himself. But now, for the first time, he understood. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. He stood slowly, gripping the photo tightly. "I won't let them take this from me," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I won't let my past decide my future." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's make a plan. We'll face it together, step by step." Malcolm exhaled, a long, ragged breath. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest didn't feel suffocating. It was heavy, yes, but it was manageable. He had a choice now, not just to survive, but to fight. And for the first time, he felt alive, not because he had been saved, but because he had decided to stand. The first day Malcolm stepped outside after leaving the hospital for good, the city felt unbearably loud. Cars honked, tires splashed through puddles, people talked and laughed on the sidewalks. The air smelled of exhaust, coffee, and wet asphalt, all at once too much and not enough. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, carrying only a small backpack Edward had provided with essentials, clothes, toiletries, and a notebook. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt cautious, yes, but present. Grace met him outside the building, her expression calm but expectant. She didn't take his hand, didn't guide him. She simply walked alongside him. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. Malcolm nodded, though the knot in his stomach told him the answer was far from simple. "As ready as I'll ever be." Edward was waiting at the curb in his sleek car, briefcase in hand. He didn't smile, but there was a trace of approval in his eyes. "You've made it this far," he said. "Now comes the real work, education, training, integration into a world that doesn't hand second chances lightly. You can do it. We'll help. But it's on you to take the steps." Malcolm glanced at Grace, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. He realized that for the first time he wasn't entirely alone. He had people who believed in him, people who trusted him to build something, to live, to matter. The weeks that followed were difficult. He enrolled in classes, learned to navigate public transportation again, and began work in a small social program sponsored by Edward's Foundation, helping people who, like him, had been overlooked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and each day brought a small sense of purpose. Malcolm kept the photograph of Nathan tucked safely in his notebook. It reminded him of what he had lost, and also of why he couldn't let his past define him. Every morning he stared at it, tracing the edges with his thumb, whispering to himself, "I'll find you someday." Grace visited often, sharing quiet conversations over coffee, listening without judgment, as Malcolm spoke of his fears, his failures, and even the tiny victories he seldom acknowledged. She didn't pity him. She simply treated him like a person, equal, flawed, human. One afternoon, standing by the window of his small apartment, Malcolm watched the city move below. People hurried past, oblivious to him, to the lives around them. But he felt connected now, alive. Not because anyone had saved him, but because he had chosen to accept help and, in turn, to take responsibility for his life again. Edward called one morning with news, a scholarship to continue education, access to a counselor, and a formal introduction to networks that could help him further. Malcolm felt a rare warmth spread through his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, something like hope, solidifying into momentum. He knew he would stumble. He knew the shadows of the streets and the weight of old memories would never fully disappear. But for the first time, he saw a future that wasn't defined by survival alone, a life where he could reclaim his dignity, reconnect with his son someday, and make choices that weren't just about staying alive. Grace came in that evening, holding 2 cups of tea. She placed one on the counter and leaned against the doorframe. "How's it feel?" Malcolm looked around the apartment, at the neat furniture, the sunlight pouring through the windows, the small stack of notebooks and textbooks he had begun collecting. He inhaled deeply. "It feels possible," he said finally. "Like maybe I'm allowed to live again." Grace smiled. "You are, and you're allowed to be proud of that." Malcolm met her eyes, then turned to the photograph of Nathan. He whispered softly, "I'll make it count, I promise." The city outside continued its relentless rhythm. Cars honked, people laughed, and the world moved on. But Malcolm Price, the man who had once been invisible, battered, and broken, had stepped fully back into it, alive, aware, and determined. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living,